larger significance by the other panelists who will follow in this session as well as in the subsequent sessions. What I'd like to begin with is that if you look at the assessments or attempts, official attempts at assessment of the impact of India's lockdown, there is one error which seems to be always creeping into such attempts to assess, which is that it seems to be incorrectly assumed that lockdown means only one thing. Okay. And there are no dimensions along which lockdowns can actually vary. So the choice that was there, as far as India was concerned on 24th or in March 2020, was a binary choice between lockdown and nothing. Okay. And it is the counterfactual situation of what would have happened if there was nothing, with which a comparison is made to justify the lockdown itself. Okay. Now, here I've indicated some of the dimensions along which it's possible, it's just an illustrative list of the various dimensions along which even lockdowns can vary. And if one has to look at the Indian lockdown did have particular characteristics which set it apart from even lockdowns that were imposed in other parts of the world. Okay. There was a certain timing to it, there was a scale to it, there was a degree to it. It was the most severe lockdown according to the analysis done by Oxford University. It was the most severe lockdown imposed in the whole world. So on the index, it was 100. And what were the objectives behind that particular lockdown? Was it to suppress the virus, to contain it within a particular area, as say happened in China, or was it to simply slow down the process and buy time? That objective was never spelled out, and I think the objectives have always been amended or adjusted according to what the actual record has actually produced. And very importantly, what were the complementary measures that would be part of that whole strategy, of which lockdown was an important element? Now, what has actually happened now that we are a year from that particular situation? What has actually happened, the interrelationship or the interaction between India's lockdown and the story of the epidemic is in a summary form set out in this table that is there before you. Okay. It shows that as of today, that is yesterday's figure, is that over 1.17 crore people in India have been tested positive for the COVID-19 infection. Okay. That's the confirmed laboratory tested number that stands today. If we go back to the lockdown, okay, if you go back to the lockdown, the number at that time was just 562. Only a very, very tiny fraction of the number that we now know today have been found to have been confirmed and infected. But if you look at how the process has unfolded, by the time India's lockdown started being withdrawn, okay, which is the unlock one, which was from June 2020, the numbers had, over the course of the lockdown, multiplied significantly. Yet, even after that significant multiplication, those numbers were still only a tiny fragment of the numbers that were subsequently to be infected. In other words, India's unlocking process itself, in a sense, revealed the problem with India's lockdown. The fact that before the cases actually started declining, India was unlocking because this lockdown process had proved to be unsustainable. So in a sense, that process itself revealed something about the nature of the lockdown and its inherent limitations. And before India's peak is achieved in mid-September 2020, number of daily cases peaked. Okay. Before that, we had gone through, or we were already in the fourth phase of the unlocking. So we had a lockdown in India, which was in operation in full force for a certain period of time, within which it didn't succeed in suppressing the infection. The epidemic continued to grow. But India started unlocking, and the infection continued to grow thereafter. Even after the peak was crossed in September 2020, if one looks at the position before the second surge begins, in a period that was less than the period it took for India to reach the peak, we had more cases in India while the trend was downwards. And now, of course, the second surge is also begun, and it's already more than a month since that second surge actually began. The sero surveys done by the ICMR also established the fact that the COVID-19 infection in India, which at the time of the lockdown was limited to a small number, limited to a small pockets in the country, had managed to spread far and wide, and large percentage of the population came to be exposed to it. If judged on the basis of this record, that lockdown process would have to be considered a disaster on even this narrow count of the impact it had on the epidemic's course in India. Okay. And to suggest that there was no scope to have done better on this count is to it seems to be rather fanciful given the actual story of what has happened. The second surge is something that we now know has begun, and we can see that if you look at the phase of rise in cases in India up from June 2020 to mid-September, when the peak number of daily cases comes, in 45 days of the second surge, we are well past 50% of that number. And in fact, it's likely that this number is going to be larger because of the fact that as of now, there are only a few states, Maharashtra, Punjab, and Gujarat, which have actually already crossed or come near their previous peaks. The rest of the states are still behind, but their numbers are also rising. So these are numbers dominated by particularly Maharashtra, but the trend of rise is there across the country in several states. So it's likely that the second phase is going to be even higher, quite in contrast to what various official models, officially propagated models that the government and the people in charge of managing COVID-19 in India have propagated. We know that there was once a model which suggested that the infection would end in May. Then the super model which said it would end in February. Till a month or so back, there were several experts saying there would be no second wave in India. But here it is, we have that second wave also. If you look at India in a kind of comparative perspective also, you find that India's number of deaths as well as cases per million population, and this is confirmed deaths and cases, is higher than the average for three continents, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, which between them account for 3/4 of the world's population. If you look at India within its own broad region, the entire contiguous region of the globe, which includes South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania, if you take all the countries within them, there is only one country, Maldives, tiny Maldives, in which both the cases and the deaths per million population is higher than in India. Otherwise, everyone else has done better, either on deaths or on cases. And on both deaths as well as cases, India is right at the top amongst the list of countries. And this is likely to become worse because certain countries like Philippines and Indonesia have actually crossed India in their second surge. Otherwise, India was higher than them, and it's likely that once the second surge picks up pace in India, we will have the similar story. Okay. Now, clearly, the lockdown didn't ensure that we were able to use complementary measures like ramping up our testing capacity in order to check the spread of the infection. What actually happened was that testing capacity increased in response to, or basically increased to keep on measuring the rising number of cases. normal got ahead of it to be able to use testing, contact tracing as a effective means of checking the spread of the virus. So for most of the period before the peak, the positivity ratio of tests in India was rising, a clear indication that the growth of testing was falling behind the spread of the infection. And it is only when the cases started declining from mid-September that you had a consistent trend of decline in the positivity ratio. But again, that process has been reversed, and you have again a rise that is associated now with the second surge, meaning that in the interim period also, after the peak, after the decline from the peak had happened, there does not seem to have been an effective use of India's the testing capacity created before the peak to actually reduce the intensity of the infection while it or to accelerate the process of decline and to prepare India better to ward off a second surge. Even that has not happened. So the lockdown did not set the stage even to prevent India from experiencing this second surge. With regard to vaccination, okay, if the objective of the lockdown was to buy some time and vaccination would become available in course of time, which would help in containing the eventual outcome of the infection, then as far as vaccination is concerned, despite the fact that all the claims about India being a major center for vaccine production in the world, India's vaccination record still reflects the global inequalities. Okay, India is, of course, not as bad here as in cases and deaths, but its record, it is still on the wrong side of the divide in the world between vaccination, on the degree of vaccination compared to the advanced countries where the vaccination process has gone much further. Most of the developed countries are far behind, but India is also a case where the vaccination is behind, is lacking, or the level of vaccination is low at a time when the cases are actually rising. And it is not unlike, I mean, it's unlike China or Taiwan or Vietnam, where the infection itself is under control. So vaccination does not have the same kind of significance for them as it has for India. But it's quite clear that there is no way that India's vaccination process, which has started from mid of January, is going to be able to prevent India's second surge, because now you have a position that if you look at even if you are targeting only 50% of the adult Indian population, in the best case scenarios feasible so far, okay, we have not even touched 6% of the required vaccinations for that. If in the best case scenario, 54 weeks is what it will take to reach 50% of the adult population, which means you're well into 2022, almost the end of the 2022, 2021-22 financial year. So as far as this year is concerned, the last year's lockdown has not ensured that at least in this year, we are not going to be facing a similar situation as we did last year. Okay. Now, all this is, of course, significant because one very visible, immediate effect of the lockdown was on the economy. Okay. And that economic contraction that the lockdown produced in India was one of the biggest and the most severe in the world. Such was the impact of that even if you take into account the so-called recovery in the later part of the year, the final figure as far as the contraction of India's GDP is concerned is now estimated to be about 8%. Okay, which will be amongst the largest contractions in the world economy. Okay, but the so in the normal course, we do not always take GDP growth as a very good indicator of what is happening to the people at large. But there is an asymmetry there. When GDP is growing, there's a positive growth. It, particularly in today's context, overestimates what is happening to the income levels of large sections of the working people. But when GDP contracts, it doesn't overestimate but underestimates the degree of contraction faced by working people. So the contraction in GDP, the scale of the impact that it has produced, the loss of incomes and livelihoods that it has produced has been immense. The migrants walking down the roads, the song that Vikas played at the beginning, was only one visible expression of this massive crisis that was produced because of the way the lockdown was implemented. Okay. Lockdowns elsewhere have not necessarily produced the same scale of effect. Okay, and in many cases, without such severe measures, countries have managed to even check the spread of the infection, including countries whose broad economic conditions are not necessarily significantly superior to India's. Okay. Now, of course, there is all this talk about the V-shaped recovery, the great growth that is going to happen in the next year, and in the restoration of India to its position of being the fastest growing economy in the world. But this is just a simple way of showing what that great recovery means, even if it happens. So if the economic survey's estimate of 11% growth for the next year holds true, you will get a certain GDP for 2021-22. If the more recent, even more optimistic estimates that have come of 12.8% increase, then you will get a certain figure of GDP. But both these figures will be lower than India's GDP in 2021-22 would have been had it grown in the last 2 years at just 2% per annum. So this recovery is no better than stagnation. Actually, if one looks at it, it's only because of the massive contraction that has happened in the year that has now ended, that or is now ending, that you get this dizzying kind of figure of 12%, 11%, 8%. It doesn't really mean that India is on track to be able to grow rapidly in after this. And this is, of course, assuming this was all based without having taken into account the fact that a second surge is likely, a second surge which, combined with the vaccination drive, is going to put a double strain on the health system, whose consequences for the economy we still do not know. And of course, this itself has to be put in context of the 8% decline is also on the back of successive slowing down of GDP growth in India, even when you look at it in terms of the relatively controversial new GDP series. On the question of the fiscal response to the COVID crisis that accompanied the lockdown, we know, of course, that even basic relief measures in India were announced after the lockdown had already been put into place and produced a crisis. Okay, so how are people going to eat in a lockdown was decided after the lockdown was imposed. Okay, those kind of things we know were characteristic of the unplanned way in which India's lockdown was imposed. But in responding to those things also, and in providing support to the economy, there is a broad divide that is existing in the world between the advanced economies and the developing countries, where even emerging economies, the scale of the fiscal response has been lower than the much larger responses that the advanced economies have been able to do, which is, of course, the COVID crisis reflecting the fundamental inequities that exist in the world order, and the fact that 30 years of globalization, 40 years of globalization have not undone those fundamental inequities inbuilt into the global economy. But even relative to what emerging economies have managed in that, India's position is below average. So the scale of the fiscal response, and of course, there was very little, as we know, spending. It was largely loss of revenues that has happened rather than spending. And much of the so-called support, or much of the support program has been what the IMF calls below the line measures, which are the equity, loans, guarantees, basically different measures to try and push credit rather than to actually spend. So the spending side, we know, has been extremely low in India. And so compared to the scale of the economic contraction that the lockdown measure generated, the corresponding support that was required, okay, was so the gap between the scale of the contraction and the fiscal response, okay, is very sharp in the Indian case because one was very high, the other was very low. Okay. And not only is it that this didn't happen, it's not going to happen, as we know now from the budget. And this extract from the fiscal policy statement makes it absolutely clear. Okay. This is what is meant for the financial markets. This is not what is publicized, but it's there in the budget documents, a clear statement about what is the intention for the future, which is a reduction in expenditure. So the fiscal response is going to become smaller. Okay. And that contraction of that expenditure is the future that is in store. Okay. But in this period, of course, while on the fiscal front, this government has been extremely shy, there are several areas in which it has been very active. Okay. So this is just a brief list of various things which the government has done, which are attempts at structurally altering the conditions within which, or the institutional context within which the Indian economy operates. Several changes of this kind have been pushed through in this particular period that we know, including a new policy on education, while there has been no effort to ensure that the long closure of the education sector in the economy is in any way seriously addressed. The disastrous situation as far as India's education is concerned, on that, nothing has happened, but a long-term policy has been adopted, and the implementation of that particular process has been at work. Okay, so I needn't elaborate on each of these because people are familiar with what all of these are. Okay, so in conclusion, then, what I would say about the is if one places India's lockdown and what has been the actual nature of that lockdown in practice, which includes everything about its components, its accompanying measures, etc., in a slightly larger historical perspective, then the key thing that I wish to emphasize here in my conclusion is this, that the lockdown itself is a symptom of a certain trend that is there in India today. Okay, a trend that has also been aggravated or reinforced by that very lockdown. Okay, so the nature of the lockdown reflected the operation of certain tendencies in India. There is an economic context. Okay, I don't have time to present the evidence for the first 3 points that are listed here, which are identifying the trends in the economy that have been characteristic of the last 1 decade. The point I wish to draw attention to here is that it is creating conditions in which the dominant interests, dominant corporate interests, their ability to sustain their accumulation and profit making process is itself in crisis now, as the effects of the crisis for the rest of India's society has spilled over onto the profit making activity itself. So India's in the neoliberal accumulation and profit making regime is in a crisis, and as this crisis deepens, it becomes more and more difficult to reconcile the interests of trying to revive that and the interests of ordinary working people. In fact, such is the crisis that because the expansionary momentum of the Indian economy is becoming weaker and weaker, a major way of sustaining profits and accumulation growth, profit growth and accumulation involves encroaching upon activities which may not still now be dominated by the corporate sector. It involves extracting more of the value that is generated within the Indian economy for profit, value that may be created in different activities across the economy, extracting more and more of that. So a certain parasitic phase of Indian capitalism is what we are presently going through. And The political counterpart of this is what we see in the nature of the regime that is currently in power. Okay, where religious nationalism and the development of a cult of personality are ultimately about creating the conditions in which the attempt is being made to try and manage under conditions where the contradictions of India's neoliberal capitalist development path are becoming sharper and sharper. And it is then the logic of that particular regime that produces the lockdown of the kind that we have. You can see the parallels between the lockdown and the demonetization experiment. Okay, so the dramatic nature of the measure, the the optics of it, rather than the efficacy of it, the doing it at such a short notice. All of these are there are parallels between the lockdown and demonetization, and the logic of the regime has actually aggravated the problem in the sense that it has resulted in demonetization, lockdown, and in between GST being three additional shocks that have adversely affected the economy. It is the logic of the regime also to see this kind of thing of a lockdown as a double opportunity, one in which you can squeeze the democratic space even further and also utilize that as the opportunity to bring about the kind of restructuring that that is required or that is desired by corporate capitalist interests today, which is to encroach more upon the value creation process within the Indian economy. So the set of measures that you see during the lockdown are all consistent with that particular kind of tendency that is operative in India today. But unfortunately, in my view, I don't see this resolving even the crisis of the accumulation process. And it might be that the regime is actually pushing Indian capitalism more and more in a direction which I describe as digging oneself into a hole, into a deeper and deeper hole, in the vain hope of striking gold at some point of time. So with that, let me conclude my presentation and hand it over to Professor Pattai. Thank you.